In the most recent Counter-Strike patch, the classic Dust 2 was taken out of the active duty map pool and replaced by a reworked version of Inferno, obviously also a classic map. Now, interestingly enough, an argument given for why this was that Dust 2 is one of the few maps that hasn't been reworked. Obviously, if we go back in history, we had Cobble and Overpass. We introduced it to the map pool in late 2014, brought out as reworked maps in, I think it was February 2015. We had Train taken out and reintroduced. It was brought back in, I think it came back in favor of Nuke in, I would think about May, maybe, I think it was early May of 2015, because I remember that DreamHack Tours was the first tournament using it. And obviously Nuke came back as a reworked map in favor of Inferno. Let me think. Well, I mean, ESL Pro League Season 3 Finals was the last one to use it, so let's go ahead and say around May, June for that one. So I'd say May for that, of 2016. Now, the original Inferno, let's just go ahead and state this at the outset. The original Inferno should never have been removed as it was. As a map, it was good. It had a lot of positives going for it. First and foremost, as someone who cares about the competitive scene, it produced incredible games. One of the best maps of all time in terms of really great matches on it, and really back and forth matches, and matches where the meta makes sense in terms of how it plays out. And if there is a blowout, usually it is a team that was very dominating, and there's a logic to where you are in the map and how you get back into a game and what the nature of a really great game looks like. Lots of opportunities for fantastic retakes, really great defensive play, fantastic terrorist play. It was one that practically no teams in the competitive scene permanent banned. I think at one point in time the CLG team in early 2016 might have perma banned it, but that's about it from off the top of my head. Practically every team was willing to play it because of what a good map it was and how many opportunities it gave you as a team. Even teams like Virtus Pro and Na'Vi, where it was right down there as like the sixth best map in their pool, pretty much never banned it in general. They always would go to their back perma bans of Dust2 and Nuke, depending, or Cash, depending on what the era was, rather than ban out Inferno. They were always willing to play it. That's why famously that was one of the conditions for beating those teams. If you were good on that map, you picked that map against them. You had a good shot in the series. The meta had shifted over the years without any rework needed as to how CT-sided it was. Sure, the classic late 2014, we remember it being incredibly CT-sided, for the best teams in the world, by the way. But go and compare that to mid-2015, and suddenly you're getting a lot of 8-7 halves. Sometimes people are winning 9 T rounds. In fact, Fnatic themselves even became much better on the T side as the meta evolved in an uptick sense. Obviously, by the time you get to late 2015, and you've got Astralis, I mean, at the time they were called TSM, and you have Envious, the Envious team that had done the French Shuffle and brought in Kennius and Apex. Now you can outright win T half on this map many times. It becomes very much about how good you are on T side. So it's not that it ever became stale and predictable and stuck in the kind of slump that I'd say something like Cobblestone is right now in terms of how the T side is if you're a very dominant, really good team, and how few options CT side has. So at the moment, we can't really know how the new Inferno plays. Maybe the new Inferno will be worse. You can't just go ahead and assume it will be better until you've seen it play out. And obviously, we don't have the kind of data set that we had for the old Inferno as to how fantastic that map was. One of the best maps of all time. Arguably the best CSGO map of all time. Now, Dust2, the outgoing map, I will say, I think as a map, in terms of conceptually and as in terms of the matches it produced, I did think Dust2 was pretty played out. That's not the whole story, though. It was played out in part due to the concept of the map. The way the layout of the map worked, I think limited the strategical depth you could have on this map. Sure, you could still be certain teams who came up with the, like NIP with the wall of smokes, and you could be very gamers back in the day. There was still teams who could be very good with a degree of tactics or with some innovation on the map. But you notice that a lot of the innovations in latter years, how you played certain areas as CT, whether that's like, I mean, well, some of the Envious guys in terms of how they played long with MBK, or, well, I mean, let's just think about the obviously TSM later on Astralis with how they played the A site at the main bomb site with Cajun B, and then Dupree or Zipnix at that lower position, and essentially let the terrorists take catwalk, but then had a fantastic defense against that. Most of the innovations were on the CT side. Terrorist side was still just playing out that slow, taking duels, and then doing your fast attack in the last 10 seconds onto a site, not literally 10 seconds on the clock, but 10 seconds of the tactic. So I do think that the map itself is what didn't allow teams to go much further. It wasn't that teams hadn't explored the meta, as you see on maps like Inferno and Cache, as they change around their meta of how CT side or T sided they are. It was kind of played out as a map in that particular sense. And so I did think it was a bit stale in terms of like the initial difficulty of getting the aim duel to be able to take a site, but then once you get into a site, CT's backing off and then doing a full retake with if they've got utility. That was a bit whack, and it did play out a bit. The problem is when it just came down to being about who kills who at that point in time, it made it less of an interesting map on a strategical level. There wasn't as much going on in that particular sense. It then just became about team play and skill in terms of being able to get those kills and win those 2v2s and do your 2v3 retake onto B, etc. I also think it was always a flawed concept that you could AWP through the double doors onto the CTs. Like, people might not understand what this means. First and foremost, it's not like people did it all the time, sure, but a point that someone made on Twitter, which is a very valid point when you think about it, is if you play as the CT who's inside B, you can actually die before you get to your bomb site. Now, there is something a bit flawed about that when you contrast the map against other maps. I don't think that's a great gimmick or dynamic in some sense, that you don't really want to choose to show for a duel. You're actually going to a bomb site, but you can get hit for health or just outright killed. Yeah, it looks cool when someone does it, but it reminds me a little bit of why in 1.6, even though I liked wallbanging on many of the maps, I thought it was a very good feature, especially for when you're in like 1v1s and the guy's hiding behind the bomb box and you know he's there, but in CSGO you can't just shoot, and if in fact you do shoot, he has a slight advantage because you have to wait for the recall to come out and he can step out and kill you. Whereas that is kind of busted in CSGO. The one map where wallbanging was just bullshit was Nuke, because if you're on Nuke and the CTs spam from ramp through the radio room wall, if they just randomly headshot one of your guys who stood around there in the lobby, there's a massive impact on whether or not the terrorists can now win the round. Likewise, go the other way. On Dust2, if a terrorist just randomly or luckily spams through a smoke or just hits a guy through a door with the AWP, then all of a sudden the CTs have a way harder time holding the B site now. It just had that small little gimmick has too much of an impact on how the round's going to play out. And I never really liked that. And I think that's one of the reasons it's such an upset map and why it's such a skill-based map. So in general, yeah, it's too much of a skill-based map. The CTs can't really push for information in the same way and have a full idea of where the terrorists are setting up from. Even if they use the buddy system and flashes out, it's only really when they have the utility advantage they can do stuff like that. So I think it was quite a flawed map in terms of I couldn't see where, it's not that teams weren't developing it more. Where could you go to get more out of the map and to make it more of a map? And that's why it was never an uber dominant map. That's a key point to make. It's always been an upset map because it relied so much on skill and then just the basic team play of how people go back into the sites. So as a result, I always used to say this, in a weird way, if you could choose, you'd never choose Dust2 to be the map you'd be godlike on. Now, obviously, teams don't have a choice. If you're a team like Classic Envious of early 2015, or G2 in the modern day, or Mousespots, it's just a map because it suits your style, and it suits your players, and you play off that skill, and it suits the tempo of how your players like to attack, then you have to play it. It's not like you can choose which map you're the best on, despite what idiot fans might think. So there's a reason why even godlike Dust2 teams tended to hover around like a 65 to 70% win rate, even in their best eras. Meanwhile, if you're a godlike team on Train or Cobblestone or Inferno, you could be up in the 80%. You could be like 85% when you're in your absolute peak. I'm thinking about Astralis and Na'Vi and VP on Overpass. You could really be up there with your winning percentage in a way that you just can't on Dust2. And so that really almost proves it in itself that it's kind of a played out map that even the best teams can't really properly dominate Dust2. They can in terms of they'll still win a solid 70-75% of the time, but there's still going to be a lot of room for them to get upset, and even by lower level teams in a way that, like, you know, SK was never going to lose Train to a really low level team. It just wasn't going to happen. And especially not a team who was very good on, who was bad rather on Train. So the knock-on effect of it being such an upset map, or rather that it being taken out and it was such an upset map and such a skill-based map, is that now, if you look at the pool of maps, we only really have Cache in terms of the skill-based maps that you can run with quite simple strats, or rather that's how it feels. Now, this is a problem because one of the key details that I always stress about the map pool is that I want the map pool, bearing in mind the map pool is how you balance the game, I want the map pool to exist in a manner which allows emphasis of every style of play and strength of team composition. Because that's the great thing. A lot of people might not know this, but up until, I think it was some point in 2011, I think the summer of 2011, we used to have 5 maps in the 1.6 map pool, but no one ever complained about lack of maps. I mean, idiot fans didn't. The same sort of people who's like, oh, I have a situation, like, because they're bored, they think you're bored. But we weren't. It was fantastic. And the reason why the map pool at 5 was amazing is because, okay, you have one ban, so you're going to ban one map out, so you've got 4 maps remaining. You're going to pick one, there's 3 maps remaining, you're obviously going to ban one each, and there's going to be the decider. Now, not only could you have more prediction of where people are going to go with the map pool, so you can prepare better, but the 5 maps made this really great distribution of style, which allowed more skills, more different skills and styles and approaches to the game to flourish. So every type of style could be successful and dominant if the team was very, very good. Now, obviously, 1.6 as a game also allowed that more, but even just the map pool, because here's how I used to break it down, okay? You had Train and Nuke. They were actually very CT-sided maps. You had to have a fantastic CT side. It's real tough to get T-rounds, so some of the best T-sided teams, like Virtus.pro and Na'Vi, could grind out the T-side rounds there to get big wins. That's why they were some of the best ever on those maps. So they're super CT-sided. Then you had Dust2 and Tuscan were really T-sided. So now, those teams who were really skill-based and like to play off Flash and Flare and sick players, they could dominate on these maps. But you notice that's a total polar opposite in general to the teams that tended to dominate on your Train and Nuke. Now, the middle map was Inferno. And the great thing about Inferno, as I've kind of pointed to in the CSGO version, is the meta was never set on that. But in general, the through line throughout history on Inferno was if both teams are really good on Inferno, it was the sort of 8-7 half map. And so Inferno was never one biased one way or another. Now, yeah, you could run the stats on every game ever played, and it obviously would show one side probably one more. But the point is, if you were a godlike terrorist team, you could be amazing on T-side of Inferno. If you were a fantastic CT team with great players at the B side, you could be dominant on CT side of Inferno. And there was always this counterplay on it, and it really was open up. So as a result, all styles were in theory accommodate for. The one downside, like I'm glad that Dust2 went out, I didn't think it was a good map, but the one downside I see to it being removed is this in theory could really hit some of the skill-based teams. Now, again, you have to take the game into account as well. I don't think it's going to be as extreme as that might sound, because actually CSGO as a game emphasizes skill more than 1.6 did. So that's not as big a problem. But at the moment, I only see cash left for those teams like, I mean, G2 doesn't exist in the same sense because they're not a lesser team anymore. Now they're so good that they probably won't matter for them. But your G2 and Mouse, teams that like, if they get onto Dust2 and Cash, have a much bigger chance of winning, that's kind of gone away to some degree there. It's not going to be as big a deal. And so now we're going to have more of a map pool that either is based around some strats, we're talking about your Mirage, obviously now Inferno's coming back, or we're going to have the heavily tactically based maps, where in theory we're talking about Train and we're talking about Overpass, and then maybe you could throw Cobble in there. I think it's halfway between the two. So what is the effect of that on the competitive scene? I thought I'd just put this in as a little bit. So first and foremost, I think the teams that fucks with a bit actually is the new Fnatic team. I think they would have benefited a lot more from Dust2, despite the fact people say, yeah, but they used to be great on Inferno. Yeah, it's irrelevant. They also lost quite a lot of key games on Inferno if you ever go and look. I think that actually Dust2 would have been a better map for them in that sense. I think the new G2, it hurts because they would have been godlike on Dust2. I think it would have been very, very dangerous. And Inferno come back, yes, they used to be good on Inferno. But I don't think it's as strong in relative to all the other teams. And I think actually it hurts Na'Vi a bit, because for me, Na'Vi developing on Dust2 was one of the ways they were going to make up for not being as good on maps like Cobblestone and some of the other maps on the T side, because they could be fantastic on this map. And obviously they were never that good on Inferno anyway. So I think those are the big name teams that it probably hurts. Now, who does it help? Well, there's a whole bunch of teams it helps. So I think it helps SK Gaming. Like, they had gotten pretty good on Dust2 in the latter days. Admittedly, that was during the parity era when everyone was a little bit more weak or had more obvious flaws to them. But I think Inferno is a map that obviously plays to them, especially how good they are on the T side. I think that can really help them out. Obviously, we don't know how they'll be with Phillips in the lineup. I think it helps Virtus.pro. They were never that sick on Inferno, but they obviously had to permaban Dust2. In theory, they don't have to permaban anything now. They can choose what they ban. That gives them a bit more variety. Astralis, I think it helps, because Astralis was good on Dust2. They certainly could play it, but I actually think that a map like Inferno is going to help them in terms of tactically. They're going to have a lot more opportunity to do work on it. So now they've got yet another map, and in my opinion, they already had perhaps the widest map pool at the moment in terms of really, really good maps. So I think that can go up there and perhaps be up there with their Train and their Overpass, and can be a real strong map for them. And they're already obviously the number one team at the moment. And I actually think, sadly, that this team's lost their player. I think if Optic had managed to retain Stanislaw, I think this actually could have helped Optic solidify and maybe become a real contender, not just like a fifth team that can do a big upset or have like really nice chance to upset but just lose in a close game. I think this could have helped their map pool out, actually, because rather than Dust2, which I thought they were a bit of a liability on, I think Inferno could have been one where, I mean, think about their T-side hits with fast attacks with Rush and so much skill, but then swapping the AWP around. I think they could have done a lot on this map. I think it's a map where Stanislaw could have done work, so it's almost a shame they've split up in that sense. Now, Dust2 obviously was the face of Counter-Strike, so I can see in that sense why Valve was reticent to remove it. It has been the map that's defined the game for so long. Funnily enough, in some sense, I initially always think of the original Dust, because when that first came out for the first year and a half, that was the map where every server in the universe was playing it. It felt like it was super popular. But as soon as Dust2 did come out, it did take over, and that is always the map where there's been 24/7 maps on that for so many years. So I can understand why they were a little bit reticent to remove it. With that said, I still think they could have gone some other ways on which map to remove. The obvious one to me to remove is Cobblestone, because at the moment that needs a rework. It has now become, in my opinion, irrevocably broken for the CTs, for the terrorist side rather. As in, if you're a really good team, I think that it's too easy to exploit, and it's still too easy to exploit that B site. So I think as CTs, you don't have as many options. It's real hard to make information plays in the same way. People try to, but it's very risky. I think that's a map that's still very flawed, and I also don't think it produces that many great games. It's actually not that fun to see a full 5-on-3 or 5-on-4 rush into the B site from the terrorists. That's not that fun, because then it just becomes a very randomized game of like who's looking at the smoke at the right time, who did get flashed by that and who didn't. It just doesn't have a lot of the great factors that I like of high level Counter-Strike. I know a lot of people suggested Cache should be reworked and should be taken out. That's purely because a bunch of the top teams don't like it. I personally like Cache. I think it's much better than Dust2 in terms of being a skill-based map, but still allowing some tactical depth and being a fun map to watch. I think it's very fun to watch, actually, in terms of the retakes. I will admit, if you were going to rework it, I think the B site of that one's the obvious one to fix. So I think that is actually flawed. I also think what actually gave Cache new life was when teams really started adopting the Molotovs, because of how that changed how the A site is played. So I still think Cache is a good map. I wouldn't remove that. Certainly I'd have Cobble and Dust2 ahead of it in terms of my rotation of what to take out. I certainly think you can make a case that Nuke should have just gone straight back out, but they're not going to do that, are they? If we look at the way Valve's doing it, they've just reworked that map. They think it still has value of some sense. They're not going to let us have that taken out. Sadly, we don't get a say in that. But I think Nuke is still fairly shit. Admittedly, teams have started to play it more, and now teams can pick it, and now most teams don't just outright ban it. Sure, that's all the case, but it's just a very flawed map. Like, essentially, they've made it possible to get more T-rounds, but not in a way that, like, is logically consistent. They've just opened it up to be even harder to cover on CT side in a way where it's not about being better, you just can't in certain ways, and there are certain blind spots it feels like on the map. So I think it's a very flawed map. I still don't like the idea, if you're a good team that's good on Nuke, of risking it and picking that map a lot, even though some teams do. It's real hard to get away with that, in my opinion. You saw even Virtus Pro almost blew it against Astralis, who's not particularly a Nuke team, in the final of the major. So in terms of this approach of taking a map out, putting a map in, I do actually like that in general. I mean, I'm certainly glad that once a map's gone, it isn't gone forever, and that they will try and rework it and bring it back in. I think that the rework approach, as a result, is a good idea. I have to give them credit. Some of their reworks have been good. Like the rework of Cobble, at least initially it was good. Like it lasted us like a good year and a half. It was still pretty good. I think now it's played out and it's fucked and needs to be reworked again. I think the rework of Overpass, I actually think was very understatedly good, actually. I think that is a good one. I enjoy that map. I like the way it plays out tactically. I think there's so many options on that map. And I think, admittedly, I have to give a lot of credit to players. By the way, that's a key note to make. Players are a big part of whether a map works and whether reworks work in that sense, because they're going to define how the map's played. The guy making that can't really know that. But I think people like Fnatic redesigning how you play that aggressive CT side for information, and then teams like VP still being very good at it, just staying back in the sites. It's so interesting that you can play those different styles but still be really successful. So I got to give them credit for that. The rework of Train was much better than the old Train. I thought the old Train was really whack and didn't really work in CSGO. It worked at 1.6, didn't work in CSGO really, probably because you can't add on the trains. There's all the clipping issues, etc. In terms of like a grenade goes slightly on one pixel and doesn't blow up when you thought it was going to kill the guy, and that's like 100% a kill, because in 1.6 you can put a grenade in front of a box and it'll just go out through the box and kill the guy. So I actually think that the Train one was pretty good. That was pretty good rework. I gotta say, Nuke's still shit. Don't think that was done well, and we obviously don't know about Inferno yet. I do think they should use the community more in reworks or bringing in new maps. I mean, I actually thought when the community in 2013 had the special editions and the ones that like Volcano and others had edited to make better competitive maps, I thought those were better than the retail ones. I wish Valve had embraced that instead of just getting rid of all those when the major system came around. I actually want more new maps. I'll probably make a video on this topic of my philosophy on how you do it, but I'd like to have these new maps thrown in there with really radically different architecture and concepts to them. And then let's see which ones stick. You'd have to do it in a very sensible manner, though, like only one at a time. And I'd start testing it on the lower level and the minor, and I'd gradually work it in if I were you. And I'd maybe even, I had this suggestion a while ago, but maybe even have a tournament where there's big money, but it's just a tournament on that one map, and it's just to get people into the meta of it. And after that tournament, people would have a sense of how to play it, and they would go hell for leather to try and win this one tournament for good money or for a special exhibition for Valve or whatever else. I actually think, people have brought up a million times, but a Tuscan or Mill, it's the same layout, remember? It's just one was owned by CPL, and actually, ironically, they were flipped in terms of the bias. But that sort of layout, it did have a lot to it. It was fun to watch. It was fun to play. I wish we could have a map like that. Obviously, Tuscan's never coming because of all that shit that happened with that Brute guy. But, okay, go out there. Find out, Valve, what the fuck happened to CPL Mill. Can we buy that? Can we make that a map again? We obviously had a version of it in early CSGO. So if you remember, there was that infamous JW Cheek video was on it when he was against ESC, the Poles. So, yeah, I think that in general it's a good approach. I can't really know what the new Inferno is going to be like. Even after looking at it and playing a little bit, that's a very different from how it will be played competitively. I do think Dust2 should have gone out, but I also think there's other candidates to remove maps.